The week had been relentless. Back-to-back meetings, endless emails, and a constant buzzing from my phone that never seemed to stop. By Friday evening, I felt like I was running on fumes. Just as I collapsed onto the couch, my fiancé, Dylan, walked in, tossing his keys onto the counter. "Guess who called?" he asked, a grin spreading across his face. I knew that look. There was only one person who could get him that excited. "Let me guess. Jason?" Dylan nodded. "Bingo. He invited us to his cabin for the weekend. Says it's the perfect getaway. Just us, no distractions." I hesitated. Jason was Dylan's best friend from college, the kind of guy who lived for adrenaline and chaos. His invitations were never simple. There was always something off about them. "The place is way out in the woods, isn't it?" I asked cautiously. Dylan shrugged. "Yeah, but that's the whole point. No cell service, no work emails, just nature and relaxation." I chewed my lip, unsure. The idea of being cut off from the world in the middle of nowhere made my stomach twist, but I could see how much Dylan wanted to go. Jason had always been that one friend who could get him to loosen up, to forget about schedules and responsibilities. "Come on, Harper," Dylan urged, nudging me playfully. "It'll be fun. We could use a break." Against my better judgment, I sighed and nodded. "All right, let's do it." The next morning, we packed up and hit the road. The city gradually faded behind us, replaced by winding roads, dense trees, and the occasional deer darting across the highway. Dylan was in high spirits, drumming on the steering wheel to the beat of a classic rock song, while I stared out the window, that gnawing unease settling deeper in my gut. When we finally arrived, Jason was already waiting for us on the porch of his lakefront cabin, grinning like he'd been expecting us for hours. "Welcome to paradise," he called, spreading his arms wide. The cabin itself was beautiful. Rustic wooden beams, a wide deck overlooking the water, and a still, shimmering lake stretching endlessly behind it. But the moment I stepped out of the car, a strange heaviness settled in my chest. It wasn't anything tangible, just a feeling, like stepping into a place where something had been left unfinished. Jason clapped Dylan on the back and pulled me into a brief hug. "I'm so glad you guys made it. This weekend is gonna be unforgettable." Somehow, I wasn't sure he meant that in a good way. As we stepped inside, Jason handed me a glass of wine and flashed his signature devil-may-care grin. No distractions, no interruptions, just good vibes. I smiled politely, but that feeling of unease didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. And something told me this weekend was only the beginning. The first night at the cabin was uneventful, at least on the surface. Jason insisted on making dinner, whipping up a surprisingly good meal of grilled steak and roasted vegetables. The three of us sat around the rustic wooden dining table, laughing over old college stories, many of which I had heard a dozen times before. But something about Jason felt different. Normally, he was effortless in his charisma, his stories and jokes flowing naturally. Tonight, though, it felt rehearsed, calculated even, like he was trying too hard to keep the mood light. After dinner, we moved to the living room, where a fireplace crackled, filling the space with a warm, smoky scent. Jason poured us each a glass of whiskey, a nightcap to unwind, as he called it. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at his lips. "You guys remember that road trip to Arizona?" he asked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "The one where Dylan got us stranded in the middle of nowhere?" Dylan chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't remind me. I really thought we were going to sleep in the car that night." "It was an adventure." Jason grinned, clinking his glass against Dylan's. Then he turned his attention to me, his gaze lingering just a moment too long. "What about you, Harper? What's the most adventurous thing you've ever done?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, racking my brain for an answer. "I don't know," I said finally. "I guess I've never really been the adventurous type. Jason raised an eyebrow, his smile playful yet oddly unsettling. You should change that. Life's too short to play it safe. Dylan didn't seem to notice the strange undertone in Jason's words, but I felt it. As the evening wore on, I became more aware of Jason's presence. The way he leaned just a little too close when he spoke to me. The way his eyes seemed to follow me even when I wasn't talking. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the intimate setting of the cabin playing tricks on my mind. But later that night, as I lay in bed next to Dylan, staring at the wooden ceiling beams, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling twisting in my gut. Then, somewhere in the house, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and far too slow to belong to Dylan. My breath hitched. I listened, straining against the silence. The footsteps paused, then started again, closer this time. I turned to Dylan, considering waking him, but just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, just the creaking of an old house. But deep down, I knew better. Something about this weekend was off, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the window should have been comforting. Instead, it only emphasized how eerily quiet the cabin was. The lake outside was so still, it looked like a sheet of glass, untouched, undisturbed. Dylan's side of the bed was empty and cold, meaning he'd been up for a while. I found him outside with Jason, the two of them laughing as they loaded fishing gear into a small rowboat. "Morning, sleepyhead," Jason called, his tone overly cheerful. I forced a smile. "Morning. What are you guys up to?" "Fishing," Dylan said, grinning. "Jason swears this lake has some of the best bass in the state." "You should come with us," Jason added, wiping his hands on his jeans. His gaze lingered on me, and my stomach twisted. I shook my head quickly. "I think I'll pass. I'll stay here and explore the house a bit." Jason's smile didn't waver. "Suit yourself. Just don't wander too far. The lake can be tricky if you don't know your way around." His words sent an unexplainable chill down my spine. I watched as they rowed out onto the water, their laughter echoing across the stillness. Something about Jason's overly perfect demeanor nagged at me. It felt like he was trying to keep us distracted, like he didn't want us asking questions. The house was quiet. Too quiet. As I wandered through its rooms, I started to take in details I hadn't noticed before. The decor was cozy, rustic. Everything felt lived in, but not recently. In the den, a collection of framed photographs lined the mantel. Most were of Jason, always smiling, always surrounded by people. But one picture stood out. It was older than the rest, faded and slightly discolored. A young woman stood by the lake, her expression unreadable. Was she happy? Or was there something in her eyes? Something uneasy? I reached out to pick up the photo, but a soft creak behind me made my breath hitch. I turned quickly. The room was empty. A trick of the old house, I told myself. Wood settling. But the feeling of being watched lingered. Deciding I needed fresh air, I stepped outside and wandered down toward the lake. The water was still unnaturally calm, reflecting the sky in a perfect, eerie mirror. I sat at the edge of the dock, letting my feet dangle above the surface. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional splash of a fish. Then, just as I started to relax, I heard it. A whisper. So faint I almost missed it. I sat up straight, my pulse quickening. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was a voice. I turned toward the water. Nothing. The lake stretched out before me, untouched and unmoving. "Dylan?" I called, glancing toward the boat. But they were too far away, their laughter still carrying across the lake. The whispering continued, just at the edge of my hearing. Soft, indistinct, but growing louder. It was coming from the water. A chill ran down my spine. I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the dock. I didn't know what was happening, but something told me the woman in the photograph wasn't just a stranger, and whatever had happened here wasn't done with this place yet. By the afternoon, Dylan and Jason were still outside, their boat floating lazily on the lake. The sight of them, so carefree, so oblivious, only deepened the unease gnawing at my stomach. I needed answers. I wandered back inside the cabin, my footsteps barely making a sound against the wooden floorboards. The quiet felt heavier now, like the house itself was listening. My thoughts drifted back to the photograph. The woman by the lake. Who was she? Something told me that if I looked hard enough, I'd find something Jason didn't want me to see. I started searching. The kitchen, the den, even the tiny storage room near the back of the house. Nothing. Then I stepped into the bedroom Jason had given Dylan and me. Something about the space felt wrong. I moved toward the wardrobe, my fingers trailing over the old wooden doors. The scent of cedar filled my nose as I pulled them open. Clothes, coats, a pair of hiking boots tucked neatly inside. At first it seemed ordinary, but then, in the dim light, I noticed something strange. A seam in the wood at the back of the wardrobe. A thin outline of a door. My heart pounded as I reached forward, running my fingers along the edges. It wasn't just a design. It was a hidden panel. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, but I couldn't. I gripped the small brass handle and pulled. The panel creaked open, revealing a narrow passage. Cold air rushed out, carrying the scent of damp wood and something stale, like old paper. I stepped inside, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The space was small, no bigger than a closet, and in the center of the room, there was a single wooden chair. It sat beneath a single dim bulb, its light flickering slightly. A chill ran down my spine. Why would there be a chair in a hidden room? I took another step forward, my pulse hammering against my ribs. That's when I saw them. Scratches. Dozens of frantic, uneven scratch marks on the walls. Some deep, others barely visible, like someone had clawed at the wood over and over again. A lump formed in my throat. Someone had been trapped in here. Suddenly, from somewhere inside the house, a floorboard creaked. I froze. The sound was slow, deliberate. Someone was in the house with me. I turned, shoving the panel closed as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking. My legs felt weak. I stepped out of the wardrobe just as another creak echoed from the hallway. Footsteps. I barely had time to scramble onto the bed before there was a soft knock at the bedroom door. "Harper?" Jason's voice. Low. Careful. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Yeah?" A beat of silence. Then, "You okay?" I stared at the door, my skin crawling. "Yeah," I lied. "Just resting." Another pause. Then, finally, his footsteps retreated. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Whatever Jason was hiding, I was getting too close. And he knew it. I sat on the edge of the bed, my heart still racing. The hidden room, the scratches, the way Jason had lingered outside the door. Something was very, very wrong with this place. I needed to clear my head. I took a shaky breath and reached for my bag, hoping that flipping through my book would calm me down. But as I reached inside, my fingers brushed against something unexpected. Something rough. Something old. I pulled it out slowly. A book. Not mine. The cover was worn leather, cracked with age. There was no title, no markings. Just a thick, heavy book that smelled of dust and something else. Something faintly metallic. Dread pooled in my stomach. This hadn't been in my bag before. Had Jason put it there? Or had I taken it from the hidden room without realizing it? My fingers trembled as I flipped open the first page. The handwriting was frantic, uneven. Some words were underlined so many times the ink had bled through the paper. At first, the sentences didn't make sense. They were scattered thoughts, phrases that seemed random. But the more I read, the more they started to form a chilling pattern. Do not trust him. Do not let him take you to the lake. The woods whisper truths. He knows your fear. I swallowed hard, flipping ahead. One passage sent a chill down my spine. She tried to leave, but the lake wouldn't let her. I turned to the last page. My breath caught in my throat. It was a single sentence, scrawled so aggressively it had torn the paper. It's too late for me. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. Who had written this? A woman? The one from the photograph? And what did it mean? The lake wouldn't let her leave. The wind howled against the windows, rattling them slightly. I needed to get out of here. I needed to tell Dylan. I grabbed the book and stood, but before I could take a step toward the door, a soft knock. I froze. The handle turned slightly, but the door didn't open. Then Jason's voice. Harper, I know you're awake. His voice was calm. Too calm. I clutched the book tighter, my heart hammering. Go to sleep, I called, trying to sound normal. Silence. Then, you found it, didn't you? My blood turned to ice. He knew. I didn't answer. After a moment, I heard his footsteps retreat. I waited until the silence stretched on long enough to convince me he was really gone. Then, carefully, I slipped the book into my bag. Whatever was happening here, I was running out of time to figure it out. I barely slept. Every creak, every rustle of wind against the cabin made my skin crawl. I kept replaying Jason's words over and over in my head. You found it, didn't you? He had whispered it like a secret, like a challenge. I needed to leave. Now, the first light of dawn crept through the window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. I slipped out of bed carefully, making sure not to wake Dylan. I grabbed my bag, the book still hidden inside, and quietly made my way out of the room. The cabin was eerily silent. I stepped cautiously down the hallway, my breath held tight in my chest. Then, from the kitchen, I heard the sound of coffee being poured. Jason was awake. I stopped just before stepping into his view. My heart pounded. I had to act normal. Taking a deep breath, I walked in. Jason was standing by the counter, stirring his coffee lazily. He looked up as soon as I entered, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. Morning, he said, his voice smooth. Couldn't sleep? I forced a chuckle. Guess I'm still adjusting to the quiet. Jason tilted his head, watching me closely. He took a sip of his coffee, then gestured toward the window. Dylan's already up, he said. He's down by the lake. A chill ran down my spine. The lake? I repeated. Jason nodded. Yeah. He woke up early, wanted to take the boat out again. Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. I needed to find Dylan. I turned to leave, but Jason's voice stopped me. You know Harper? He paused as if choosing his words carefully. You really should be careful where you go poking around. I froze, my hand gripping the strap of my bag. Jason took another sip of his coffee, never breaking eye contact. This place, it has a way of remembering things. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked straight out the front door, forcing myself not to run. The air outside was crisp, but it did nothing to ease the unease curling in my chest. I spotted Dylan down by the water, sitting on the dock, his feet dangling above the surface. Relief flooded me. But then I saw something that made my blood turn cold. He was staring straight ahead, not moving, not blinking, just staring. I rushed toward him, my pulse racing. Dylan? No response. As I got closer, I realized his lips were moving. He was whispering something. My skin prickled. "Dylan?" I repeated, my voice sharper. This time he blinked. Slowly, he turned his head toward me. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused. I knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder. "Hey, what's wrong?" Dylan exhaled shakily, as if snapping out of a trance. He looked around like he was just realizing where he was. "Harper?" His voice was hoarse. What time is it?" I frowned. "It's morning. What are you doing out here?" He rubbed his temples. I don't know. I woke up and I just came here." A sick feeling settled in my stomach. I reached for his hand. It was ice cold. "Come on," I whispered. "Let's go back inside." Dylan hesitated, glancing once more at the still, glassy lake. Then he nodded. As we walked back, I cast one last look over my shoulder. For the first time since we arrived, the surface of the lake was no longer still. A ripple. Small, almost imperceptible. Like something had just gone beneath. Or was coming up. Dylan was quiet as we walked back to the cabin. Too quiet. His grip on my hand was firm, almost as if he needed grounding, like he wasn't fully back to himself yet. Jason was still in the kitchen when we entered. He didn't say anything. He just sipped his coffee, watching us with unreadable eyes. I felt a sharp urge to get Dylan as far away from him as possible. "Come on," I whispered, pulling Dylan toward the bedroom. Once inside, I shut the door behind us and turned to him. "Dylan, what the hell happened out there?" He rubbed his face, looking exhausted. I don't know. I woke up before sunrise and something just told me to go outside. It wasn't like I was sleepwalking. I knew I was awake, but I didn't feel in control. My stomach twisted. And then? He hesitated. I don't remember much, just sitting there, staring at the water. I felt like something was calling me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The book's words echoed in my mind. "Do not let him take you to the lake." I grabbed my bag and pulled the book out, flipping through the pages until I found the passage that had chilled me before. She tried to leave, but the lake wouldn't let her. I looked up at Dylan. "I think this place is cursed." He frowned. "Harper, I'm serious." I shoved the book into his hands. "Look at this. Someone wrote about this place, about the lake, about Jason." Dylan skimmed the pages, his expression darkening. "Where did you find this?" I hesitated. "There's a hidden room in the house. It was in there." His head snapped up. "A hidden room?" I nodded. "And there were scratches all over the walls, Dylan. Someone was trapped in there. Someone who wanted to escape." Dylan's hands tightened around the book. I lowered my voice. "I don't think Jason just owns this cabin. I think he's part of whatever's happening here." Dylan shook his head. "That doesn't make sense. Jason's my best friend. He wouldn't—" A soft knock at the door made both of us jump. Jason's voice followed, smooth as ever. "Everything okay in there?" I exchanged a look with Dylan. He hesitated before responding, his voice calm but clipped. "We're fine." Silence. Then, "Good. Breakfast is almost ready." His footsteps retreated. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension still coiled in my chest. Dylan closed the book, setting it down carefully. "We need to get out of here." I nodded. "Today. Before sunset." But deep down, I had the sinking feeling that the lake wasn't done with us yet. And neither was Jason. We didn't wait for breakfast. As soon as Jason walked away, I turned to Dylan. "We're leaving, now." Dylan nodded, his jaw tight. "Let's pack fast." I threw our things into my bag, barely bothering to fold them. My hands were shaking. I could feel it. Something in the air had shifted. The house felt heavier. Almost like it knew. Like it knew we were trying to leave. Dylan zipped up his duffel. We get to the car, we don't stop, we don't talk to Jason, we just go. I nodded, slinging my bag over my shoulder. We stepped into the hallway. Jason was nowhere to be seen. The front door was just a few steps away. Dylan reached for the handle, but the moment he touched it, the entire cabin went dark. The lights, the appliances, everything. A complete and suffocating darkness swallowed the space. Then, from somewhere outside, a splash. Not just a normal splash, a deep one. A weighty, echoing disturbance from the lake, like something had surfaced, or something had been thrown in. My breathing turned shallow. Dylan. Move, he whispered, gripping my wrist. We pushed through the door, bursting out onto the porch. The morning sun was blinding after the suffocating dark inside. Jason was standing at the edge of the dock, waiting. He turned when he heard us, a slow, easy smile curling his lips. Going somewhere? Dylan stiffened beside me. Yeah, we're heading out. Jason clicked his tongue, shaking his head. You sure? You haven't even had breakfast. Something about the way he said it, so casual, so calm, made my stomach twist. Dylan took a step forward. Move, Jason. Jason sighed dramatically. You know, people don't just leave this place, Dylan. Dylan clenched his fists. Watch me. Jason grinned. All right, but before you go... He turned to me, his gaze locking onto mine. You should tell Dylan what you saw. My breath caught. Dylan frowned, looking at me. Harper? What's he talking about? Jason took a step toward us. Tell him, Harper. Tell him about the woman in the water. A lump formed in my throat. He knew. I grabbed Dylan's arm. We have to go. But Jason only chuckled. I mean, it's not like she's the first, right? I froze. My fingers tightened around Dylan's wrist. Jason tilted his head, his grin widening. And if you leave, she won't be the last. Dylan grabbed my hand and yanked me toward the car. We sprinted. Gravel crunched under our feet. My lungs burned. I didn't look back. The car was just ahead. Just a few more feet. But then, the engine wouldn't start. Dylan turned the key again. And again. Nothing. Jason's voice carried over the quiet. You don't get it, do you? He took a slow step forward. The cabin won't let you leave. Panic clawed at my throat. Then, from behind me, a whisper. A woman's voice. I turned, and I saw her, standing at the edge of the lake, dripping wet. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine. The woman from the photograph. My breath caught in my chest. She raised one trembling hand and pointed at Jason. His smirk faded. For the first time, he looked afraid. The wind picked up, swirling violently around us. The lake, so still before, began to churn. Jason took a step back. No, you can't. The woman moved forward. The ground beneath Jason shifted. Then, he was gone, sucked into the earth, pulled toward the lake as if the water had claimed him. The wind stopped. The lake stilled. The woman, she was gone. And just like that, the car started. Dylan didn't hesitate. He threw it into reverse, gravel flying as we sped away from the cabin. We didn't speak. Not until we hit the main road, the cursed place fading into the distance behind us. Finally, Dylan exhaled shakily. What the hell just happened? I looked at him, and I whispered the truth. I don't think Jason owned that cabin. I think it owned him.